Hi guys, I'm Calder from Calder's Ceramics, and in today's video I will be showing you how to make a bird pot. I will be showing you how to throw and trim it on the pollard's wheel, and later on I will also be glazing it with a blue glaze combination. So without any further ado, let's head over to the wheel and get started. I take a big piece of clay because the ball is also going to be quite big and I'm also throwing on a big bed. Then I start centering the clay. Centering a bigger piece of clay can be a little bit more difficult and might take a little bit more time, but if you just keep pressing it towards the middle, it will eventually get centered. First I press it to the middle so that's already a little bit centered, and that way I make sure that it got stuck to the bed. And then I cone it up. Because it's such a big piece, I sometimes cone it up twice, so I press the clay higher twice to get more height, and then I push it back down, and I repeat this multiple times until the clay is fully centered. And then I press the clay downwards quite far. I just do this by pressing quite hard with my fist, and I first hold my left hand on the side to make sure the clay stays centered, and then when the clay is a little bit flatter I hold both of my hands on top of each other to put even more pressure onto the clay. And that way I press the clay downwards to make it a bit wider. That will make it easier to make a wide and flat ball, which is going to be the bird bed. When pressing the clay downwards I also make sure that the clay at the side is attached to the bed, so I press on top of this an extra time when holding my left hand on the outside. Then I start opening up the shape. I like to use a sponge for bigger pieces because this way the clay stays wet and the clay can't get stuck to my fingers. And just like this I move my hands very slowly towards myself and I open up the clay like this. And I try to move them horizontally and keep the bottom flat. And with big pieces like this it's often necessary to go over it an extra time to make the bottom a little bit thinner and to get more clay on the sides. Because the clay on the side sometimes becomes a little bit uneven, I press this back into the middle by holding both of my hands around it. It can be quite hard to see how thick the bottom of these pieces is, so sometimes I like to take my needle tool and I press this into the bottom. Then I hold my finger on top of the clay and then I take it out, and that way I can see how thick the bottom is. The bottom was a little bit thinner than a centimeter, so I found it thin enough, but if it isn't thin enough you can just go over it a few more times to make it thinner. I did go over it once to make sure that the hole closed from the needle tool, and then I started pulling up the walls. I take a sponge in my right hand and I press towards my left hand on the inside while making an upwards movement. And I move my hands quite slowly, especially with a big shape like this you really want to be careful that it doesn't collapse. And as you can see I first start making a straight cylinder, so I pull the clay upwards in a straight line. And then when I have a little bit more height and the clay is a bit thinner, I start slowly pulling it outwards and I start making the shape a little bit more round. And then sometimes I take a little bit of water out of the inside because you need to keep the sides wet where you're working, but you don't want the bottom to become too wet. And just like that I go over it a few times to pull the clay slowly outwards and make it rounder. And then I get rid of the water that's on the inside and the outside, and then I start blow drying it. I've done a little bit of research on what birds like for a bird bed, and it turns out that some birds like to have a bit of a bigger surface to sit on. So I will be folding the rim outwards so that the rim is a little bit thicker and the birds have a bigger surface to sit on. And when doing this there is a big chance that your ball will collapse, so to prevent this I like to use a heat gun to dry it and make it a little bit harder. So I dry the inside and the outside, but I don't dry it too long. You don't want the clay to become leather hard or something, you still want to be able to throw it into a different shape. Then I wet the rim again. This might seem a little bit weird, but if the rim is dry you can't really throw, otherwise the clay might get stuck to your fingers. So it is important to wet it, but the clay now is a bit stronger so it's easier to pull it outwards. And then I hold my hands around the rim and I slowly press the clay at the top outwards. So as you can see I hold my right hand on the outside and I fold the clay outwards on top of my right hand. And I also like to hold the sponge. The sponge makes it nice and wet and make sure that the clay doesn't stick to my fingers. And just like that I fold the rim a little bit more outwards so that it becomes flat and the birds have a bigger surface to sit on. I felt that the clay was becoming very soft again and I was afraid that it would collapse. So I again took my heat gun and I dried it a little bit more to just make it a little bit harder. And then I pressed the clay downwards a little bit more so that it was horizontally and flat and the birds have a nice place to sit on. And then the shape is finished and I get rid of any water drips that were in the inside and on the outside. And then I took this wooden knife and cut away a little bit of excess clay at the bottom. And I also cleaned my bed with this. This just saves a little bit of time when trimming it. And then the piece is finished and ready to dry before I can trim it. I just let it dry on the bed and I don't cut it off. I just wait till it comes off itself. I'm throwing on a plaster bed, so I just waited a few days before it came off. Since it's a bigger piece it might take a little bit longer because it dries a bit slower. In case you were wondering why I blow dry so much, here I have an example of a ball where it did collapse. There was nothing wrong with the ball, but the clay was just very soft, and because I folded it outwards it became too heavy for itself and then it just collapsed like this. So by blow drying it you can prevent this from happening. And then when the ball came off of the bed and it's leather hard, I start trimming it. So I place it upside down on top of my giving grip and then I cut away some clay. I first make sure that the bottom is nice and flat and I go over it with this trimming tool. It was quite flat because it came off the bed and I didn't cut it, so it was just nice and flat. And I cut away quite a lot of clay on the sides here. I had quite some excess clay here because I made the shape quite round, and if I don't leave this clay here, the whole ball will collapse, so I just prefer to trim this away. So just go over it with this tool multiple times, just cut away more and more clay and make it a nice and round shape. I also like to take away a little bit of clay at the bottom to make a foot ring on it. This will just make the piece a little bit lighter, and that way it will also be nice and flat when standing. When I'm done with trimming, I like to go over it with a wet sponge. This will help me to smooth it out. And then I go over it with this tool, which helps me to get rid of the slip that was created by the sponge. And then I go over it with my finger another time to fully smooth it out. I wanted to trim away a little bit more clay off the sides, and to do that I put these other arms onto the giving grip so that I can trim a little bit lower. And just like this I trimmed away a bit more clay from the side, and that way I made it into one fluent shape and made it nice and round. And I also made this smooth in the same way as I did with the bottom. And then the bird bed is finished and ready to dry before biscuit fire. And then when the piece is biscuit fired, I started glazing it. The first glaze that I use is Blue Midnight, and I apply 3 coats all over the piece on the inside and on the outside. It's important to let the glaze dry in between coats, so if you'd like you can use a heat gun to speed up the drying. The second glaze that I'm going to use is Norse Blue from Mako, and I apply 2 coats of this glaze all over the inside and over the top part of the outside. I'm not glazing all the way down on the outside because I wasn't sure if this glaze was going to run when melting in the kiln, and I didn't want it to get stuck to my kiln shelf, so I didn't glaze it all the way down to the bottom at the outside. And then I applied a 3rd coat only on the top. I hope that this will give a nice effect in color. And then the glazing is done, and I always get a little bit of glaze on the bottom, and I get rid of this by twisting it on top of this wet piece of fabric. It's quite easy, I just twist it on top of here to get rid of the glaze, otherwise the glaze will melt in a kiln and get stuck to your kiln shelf. And then the piece is finished and ready to go into the kiln for a glaze fire. And here's the video of the birds enjoying the bird feeder and also some pictures of the glaze. That was it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you liked and learned something new from it. If so, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't done it yet. And if you're going to make some bird balls yourself and going to post it on Instagram, please tag me at Calder because I would love to see it. I hope to see you next week. Bye!